Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's episode is a roundtable discussion with guests Pádraic E and Ewoud van Rijn. Taken from his website, www.pádraicmore.com, Pádraic is a writer, curator, and art historian. He holds a BA in the History of Art and English Literature from University College Dublin, an MA in Visual Art Practices from IADT Dublin, and completed Curator Lab, the postgraduate program at Konstfack University in Stockholm. Pádraic is a former resident of the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, the Netherlands. His practice is shaped by the belief that visual art enables alternative modes of interaction in a world increasingly led by technological rationality. Pádraic's projects often examine how contemporary culture has embraced aesthetics and ideals informed by esoteric traditions. Ewoud van Rijn is an artist, tutor, and team coordinator in painting and printmaking at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, the Netherlands, where he also studied. Taken from his academia.edu page, Ewoud's content is fueled by the ever-recurring discussion on the end of art, which is taken as a metaphor for today's cultural and moral state of affairs. He researches the cultural dimensions of neo-paganism, specifically Wicca or modern witchcraft. Employing a wide range of media, from drawing to artist publications and from installation to performance, Van Rijn's research explores neo-paganism as an invented revivalist tradition based on rejected knowledge. Ewoud has also recently been exploring an artistic dialogue with Kurt Seligmann, the surrealist specialist on magic and the occult, and this dialogue is reflected in the work showcased in a recent exhibition called The Great Invocation that Pádraic curated at Garage Rotterdam earlier this year from September to November. As you have probably guessed by now, we are talking about the esoteric or the occult in contemporary art, and I greatly appreciate Pádraic's and Ewoud's generosity in helping me to understand this fascinating area a bit better. This episode covers a lot of material, so for these intros I will try to give you the highlights. In part 1, Pádraic and Ewoud both talk about their backgrounds and their own interests in the esoteric or the occult, and then we move on to talk more about the inspiration for the Great Invocation exhibition, plus Ewoud's inspiration for his own installation there. We talk about the Theosophical Society as a movement and how it relates to contemporary art. We talk more about Kurt Seligmann and the surrealists' viewpoints on art, magic, and the potential of the human mind. And Ewoud discusses an experience he had in search for a new form of art practice. I hope you enjoy part 1. Welcome to the podcast, Pádraic and Ewoud. I'm very, very happy to be speaking with you both today.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation.
Thank you. It's exciting.
I'm sorry, Ewoud. I was speaking over you. Yes, we have two guests today to discuss art and the occult, or art and the esoteric. And we're having a bit of, at least I am having a bit of an issue today that I can't access the camera on my computer. So my wonderful guests cannot see me, although I can see them. So we are going to just try to make the best of this situation today and have a great discussion about art and esotericism, or art and occultism. I probably will be using those terms interchangeably, so I hope that does not cause any type of confusion. The inspiration for this interview came from an exhibition called The Great Invocation that was presented at Garage Rotterdam, art gallery in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, of course, curated by Pádraic E. And I was alerted of this exhibition by Dr. Marco Pasi, who has an interest in the esoteric and art. And I went to view it with a friend and colleague of mine, Thomas van Breda, and we met Ewoud and talked to Ewoud a little bit about his installation. And from there, it kind of developed into, maybe we could get together and talk about art, because while I do not have any type of expertise in art history, or even as performance art in more of a personal aspect, I am very interested in it. And I don't know anything about theory and methods. I don't know anything about any of that, but I am very interested in it, and especially in the esoteric connections of art. And I wanted to give more attention to this on my own podcast and give it a platform as well. So with all of that being said, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to start out with asking you both about your own interests in esotericism or the occult, or occultism, however you choose, however you prefer to say it, and how you became interested in this whole field. If you would care to give a little bit of a background on that.
I was born in 1967 in The Hague, southwest, and I was born in a kind of a strict Catholic family there. So religion has always been an issue for me from early on in my life. And I guess that's where the interest started, as a kind of problematic relationship with that. I think the occult came about, the interest in the occult and esotericism came about because I think my generation in the 80s were actually had a heightened interest in this because of especially post-punk goth culture and stuff like that. Horror movies, comics, where the occult was very much present in the 80s.
Right.
So it kind of became a formative influence on me culturally, as a kind of maybe an alternative to my upbringing. At some point, I went to the Art Academy in The Hague, and I was on an exchange to England in 87. And I met a fellow student on the bus, and he started talking to me about the Illuminati trilogy of Robert Anton Wilson. And I bought that book and I read it while I was doing the exchange, and I was kind of blown away by it, so to speak. And that sort of really introduced me to a lot of its subject matter, so to speak, in the way that it's current. What else? So that was an important moment for me to get more interested in that. I bought a lot of Robert Anton Wilson books later on as well and read them. And then around 2010, I think, I was in my own practice. I started getting interested in all discussion about the Enlightenment, the political discussion about the Enlightenment that was going on at the time. And I was looking into literature on this, and I came across a title, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, by Yeats. And so that was suddenly a completely turnaround of the subject, so to speak. Because it went into the esoteric and the occult culture of around the Enlightenment age. And around this time, I also met Marco, and it was a funny thing. He drove me around. We met through a friend, and we were doing a gallery tour, and he drove me around on the back of his bike. And at some point, I asked him, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm a professor in the history of religion, and I'm specializing in esotericism. And I was carrying the Yeats book on me at the time in my bag. So I pulled it out and I said, oh, do you know this book? and then he said, well, yeah, that sort of opened the field, right. the whole field. And that started a really wonderful friendship with Marco. And from then on, really, I've been really in my practice being focused on this subject. Culminating in the exhibition that you've just visited. Yeah.
Okay, that's a very funny story about the "Do you know that book?" That's very funny.
It is.
But for the listeners, that book is written by Francis Yates, called the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and the other trilogy that Ewoud referred to was the Illuminatus, and that is the Discordian trilogy. So, if listeners might remember, we talked about Discordianism with Dr. Christian Greer some episodes ago. So here, so we have this nice mix of the Discordians and the Rosicrucians and all of these lovely currents that are melding and mixing together. That is great.
And Stephanie, now you mentioned Christian. I met Christian also through Marco, and I had some publication collaborations with Christian.
Great.
Which was a wonderful experience. Yeah.
Great. So, Pádraic, could you talk a little bit about your own interest?
Yeah, well, I think like a lot of people who are on this path, there is a constellation of biographical events which shape one's direction, and I'm going to skip all of those and just arrive straight at when I was studying art history in Dublin in the early noughties. And I think I was introduced to abstraction in painting for the first time via slide projected images of images by Casimir Malevich and Kandinsky. And I suppose you don't have to dig very deep behind those images to realize that they are both the manifestations of quite a deep investigation of invisible worlds that are often kind of informed by quite deep philosophical engagements. And that for me was an important kind of portal into looking, I think, at some of the thinking behind, well, particularly 20th century art, particularly that which has been occluded by what would have at one point been called official art histories. And so I think I've spent the last 20 years looking at ways that engagement with esoteric paths has informed cultural life. And in terms of this particular project, which you saw in Rotterdam, the Great Invocation, I met Ewoud at a conference called Enchanted Modernities in Amsterdam in 2013, where I was speaking about occultism in fin de siècle Dublin, looking specifically at the Theosophical movement in its infancy in Dublin at the sort of late 19th century. Just giving a paper on that. And Ewoud and I struck up conversation afterwards. And I think a little bit like Ewoud, you have these situations, these beautiful serendipitous encounters which lead to greater things. And I think that has been sort of a motif throughout the last 20 years of my my work in this field is that there are often these serendipitous encounters which lead to greater things. So I suppose, we can kind of talk a little bit about some of the projects that have emerged and how they've been informed by specific strands of esoteric thought. But I think maybe it's important to note that I was born in 1982, and I think anyone who was at a formative age in the 90s, you had, quite a lot of really, apart from the geopolitical catastrophes that were occurring, you also had events surrounding movements like Heaven's Gate, Waco, Solar Temple, Shinriko. And growing up in Ireland, of course, which is a place of great religious conflict, there was always a curiosity, to sort of get to the essence of what spiritual life is without some of the more destructive trappings that can often surround it. And I think that's also a thread which is at maybe the essence or the heart of my cultural work.
Very interesting. I'm very interested to explore this whole idea of how art is tapping into that quest to find the spiritual. So I guess let's shift back, I guess I could say, to the exhibition, the Great Invocation. I thought this was very interesting, as this was related to and perhaps based upon a mantra by Alice Bailey, someone from the Theosophical movement. So, Pádraic, could you talk a little bit more about how that came about? How was that mantra? Did you already know that mantra? What was this about the mantra that was so important for the basis?
Maybe to sort of backtrack and also to cover part of your previous question, I suppose the Theosophical movement is something that I've been quite preoccupied with exploring and I'm maybe excavating for the last 15 years in particular. And so several exhibitions that I've curated over the last few years have been really informed by trying to explore the convergences between theosophical systems of esoteric thought and the sort of cultural manifestations of those. So an earlier exhibition was actually looking specifically, which I curated in Dublin, at the Dublin City Gallery, the Hugh Lane, was looking at a series of murals that were painted by a number of theosophists in a sort of shared communal house in the 1890s. And so I built an exhibition of contemporary work, new commissions, by artists who were responding to, in a speculative way, that particular episode in art history. And also included in that exhibition was a series of intriguing publications that the Theosophical Society had themselves published, both in Ireland, but also wider and more broadly circulated magazines like Lucifer, etc. So this more recent iteration of this kind of series of exhibitions, the Great Invocation, was again trying to look at a very specific episode in theosophical history and maybe resurrect it to see what potential lay in there. And in so doing, I guess, reveal some of the idiosyncrasies of some of the individuals. I mean, Bailey is a kind of controversial figure within the history of theosophy, and maybe we can talk in a moment about what theosophy is, because I'm not sure that's been explored properly yet. But so I think Bailey, she fits into the long canon of 20th century thinkers who mediated or claimed to channel ageless wisdom, and in her case, the mantra which bodied forth was the Great Invocation. So I thought this was an interesting starting point for an exhibition, primarily because it itself was channeled at the end of World War II, at a time in which the self-destruction of society seemed quite likely. It was pending. And so I guess it struck me as sort of a timely moment in which to resurrect Bailey's mantra, which she saw itself as a sort of it held the potential within it to sort of, to quote her, to save humanity from self-destruction. So I wanted this to be the starting point for the exhibition. And so that notion of channeling or received knowledge is a motif that ran throughout the exhibition. And we can talk later on about, how also that ties into ideas of automatism, which is, again, a key strategy throughout 20th century art. So that maybe gives you a little bit of an idea as to why I selected Bailey's mantra as a starting point for the Great Invocation.
Yes, it does. And thank you for explaining that. I think that helps the listeners as well get a context, and also very fitting one that, we're now again in a situation where it does often seem that humankind needs saving from itself in many cases. Ewoud, you are one of the artists who has had an installation. Now everything is now all cleaned up and removed from the gallery, but or the exhibition hall. But your installation, if you could talk a little bit more about how your work fits into this idea about Alice Bailey's mantra and the ideas behind that.
Okay, yes. And by the way, new show is already opening tonight at Garage.
Yes.
Well, of course, my work is not directly related to theosophy, but to surrealism and the context that created in modernism, in modernist art, and the resonances of that, kind of the echoes of that today. But I think the kind of spiritual revival that happened in the late 19th century, of which theosophy probably was the biggest impact. It was certainly in a way related, surrealism in a way was related to that. And especially from 1929 on, when André Breton wrote his second manifesto and called for the occultation of surrealism. And there's discussion about what he actually meant by that. But at the same time, it's a word with a lot of historical, philosophical ramifications. So I think he knew what he was doing and what he was calling for. And some of those artists took it literally, and they really started looking into the occult and into the esoteric, of which Seligmann was one, and he became actually the man of expertise for the surrealists on these matters. So Pádraic and I more talked in our preparations towards the exhibition about Seligmann and invocation of Seligmann through my own practice, so to speak. And also there's an interesting photograph of Seligmann in his studio where he's doing actually a public, an invocation in public. So I was more related to invocation in that sense, and having kind of invocated Seligmann in the work in the studio as a artistic ancestor that I was in dialogue with by actively engaging with his work. So that's pretty. That is what my work was concerned with.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to point out just that Theosophy itself, which was founded in the US in 1875, it did itself emerge, I think, from the ashes of spiritualism, which of course was really built on this idea of sort of seance or channeling or calling down entities, unseen entities. And so even though there are sharp distinctions between spiritualism and theosophy, I think there are aspects of spiritualism which are themselves kind of rekindled by the 1920s by surrealism. You know, they themselves try and access these strategies for overriding the conscious cerebral mind to as a sort of strategy for artistic production. So I think that's really an important thing to mention, is maybe something we can kind of, I think will be a thread that we return to throughout this talk, is how generative a lot of the strategies and ideas or concepts that are borrowed from all forms of occultism and esoteric practices throughout the 20th century, whether that be ritual magic or whether that be, you know, forms of meditation, they find their way into the world of art and stay there, even when they themselves become sort of defunct by the movements that initiated them.
Thank you for that. I could ask a question about surrealism as an approach. From what I had learned about surrealism is that it was very focused on the feminine. It was very psychological. And when talking about Kurt Seligmann, who is your artistic ancestor, Ewoud, I'm wondering, was this a focus on the occult? Was this a direction that Seligmann took that was new, that was different than what other surrealists were doing? Or did this all fit into the idea about what surrealism was all about?
No, I think he added a layer, really. In his explorations of the occult, I think he brought more depth to that matter, so to speak, in these circles. Breton, of course, was the leader and the theorist of the surrealists, and I think you can say that. Pretty much everyone who was involved in the movement followed kind of the party line of the manifestos. Yeah, of course, there's always been difficulties in the group because of this. But if you talk generally about surrealism, I think you can remark that. Breton had two limitations, I think, very basic limitations. And that was one was on a political side that he saw surrealism as a revolutionary movement, and it was Marxist oriented. But he never wanted to kind of join the party, or that surrealism would be subordinate to the Communist Party's party line. That was one. I'm using the word limitation, but that's not so much as a qualification, but more like he kept it contained in that sense. Within itself, and the other one was on the spiritual side, actually, on the where you talk about metaphysics, that he didn't that he saw the world as something immanent and not as something transcendent. So there was nothing like a Platonic world of ideas behind, visible reality, or there's nothing like a spirit world that is kind of separated from ours, and there's certainly no hereafter in the Christian sense. So there's no transcendence within surrealism in his view. And of course, when you talk about occultism, all these things come into play. When you talk about esotericism, all these things come into play, and that's what Seligmann kind of opened up with his researches, I think, and his what he did in writing the history of magic and publishing that in 1948. So that's. Is that answering your question?
Yes, it is. Thank you for explaining that, because for someone like me who's more of a layperson, and maybe for some of the listeners as well, there might be a little bit of a disconnect or a confusion as to how the occult and how ideas about magic and even more ideas that come from spiritualism or other occult movements, how this plays into surrealism. I think what Seligmann, what attracted him to magic was kind of the imagination, the room for the imagination that supplied. He said magic is the world of the artist. He saw the artist and the magician as a kind of similar, having a similar role. I see.
If I could just interrupt there for a moment, I think it's really important to kind of backtrack a bit, just to broaden things out. I guess because I think we're getting very specific without maybe explaining these distinctions. I mean, I think like the 20th century, this revival of magical practices is really widespread, and there is obviously kind of occult organizations leading that. So, but really it's a bigger question, isn't it, about what magic is? And that's kind of something, this revival of practices, it's about being able to affect change with like the practical applications, the idea that magic can actually have a real impact on wider human life, and that it's not relegated to the fringes, because effectively it is itself a form of science, isn't it? That up until, we could say, I don't know, let's take the 16th century, was viewed as having very real implications. So I think there are, like, it's really important to see that as well within the 20th century. There's a spectrum of artists who are looking at magic in this way. It's maybe a slight detour from, it's maybe important to mention that as well, amongst Theosophists, Alice Bailey is quite singular in that she actually writes about magic. Ritual magic is not something that most Theosophists have much engagement with. So again, it's maybe a relevant thing to mention is that Bailey herself, she wrote a book, a treatise on white magic. So it's just something I guess I wanted to make a sort of broader reference to. Within the 20th century, you have this kind of whole revival of magical practices, which I think are, parallel to surrealism. Obviously, you have people like Crowley writing magic in theory and practice, which is not occurring as part of surrealism, but simultaneous to it at the same time.
Right,
so it's part of a bigger trend within thought.
Yes. And if, just thinking about occultism in the sense of how it fits into this whole larger picture of, religion and science, the idea was that occultism was supposed to be able to bring religion and science together, because it was the answer for all of these discrepancies or these issues that always arose within science or always arose within religion. This was supposed to be the glue that brings them both together. So that's very interesting that all these ideas are always in the consciousness of a culture, even if they're not explicitly talked about. They're coming out and expressing or expressed through various means, and art is one of those things, of course. So I guess we should now probably come back to the topic of theosophy, as Pádraic was talking about it earlier. And I just mentioned about this idea of these a spirit, as it were, that is present in a culture. If you would like to talk about your ideas about why you think that theosophy and the ideas that came out of that, why that was so important to popular culture and also to contemporary art, for that matter.
Well, I think, you could consider sort of theosophical approaches to it's you could consider it really the beginning of the New Age movement, which at this point has become so saturated that I think you can't even call it occluded anymore. It's actually been fully saturated throughout the 20th century, to the point that many of the ideas that were popularized by the theosophical movement are now really part of our daily furniture. And rather than being somehow invisible, or maybe they have become invisible by their ubiquity, possibly. But I think really there's a precursor to sort of New Ageism, but also there is an eclecticism to theosophical thought, which is very modern in its kind of a la carte approach to what faith can be. And the fact that it also emerged at a time of secularization and heavy industrialization, really, it emerged from a time of change, in unprecedented change. And so I think that's relevant to the moment in which we live in now. The fact that it sort of tapped into ancient thought, but was also quite inclusive and became often, a part of greater social movements. I'm very attracted to the idea that one can still engage with the spirit realm while also being deeply practical and potentially political. I think these things need to be brought together more. So the idea that it was both a catalyst for change, but also togetherness seems very relevant.
Yeah. Well, the idea that everything is interconnected. That doesn't have to be a very out there idea. You can still be, as you said, very rational and still have that idea that everything is connected. So, Ewoud, your thoughts?
Yes. Well, I have to talk more from the context of surrealism again.
That's fine, no problem.
Seligmann was held very much to that dictum of as above, so below. So a kind of interconnectedness of everything, and a reflection of the higher into the lower, so to speak. I think theosophy, in a way, was also for artists a kind of limitation. They weren't very engaged with artists and artists' practices. I was quite surprised to hear, for instance, when they had conferences that artists weren't allowed to bring their work in and to exhibit that. There's only one example of that happening, and that was very reluctantly. So it wasn't so friendly, actually, to art and artists' contributions. When you hear about Hilma af Klint, contacting Steiner about her art, he was very reluctant, and he was very patronizing towards her, which gave her a big shock, actually, that disabled her to work for about 6 years or so. So that kind of surprised me always. And on the other hand, there's in the Dutch context an artist like Piet Mondrian, who considered himself the theosophical artist. But it still wasn't very out there in the way that his work was received, so to speak. But I think that kind of changed within the aftermath of surrealism. So I guess it's because it's in that sense less dogmatic or organizational, and more open for individual inputs, and of course it's very much, although they Breton wanted to, he actually didn't want to produce art, he wanted to produce anti-art, but it's still in the realm of art, and so the whole place to begin with is different. It's not a spiritual movement, but an art movement. Incorporating ideas of the spiritual, the occult, and the esoteric. So there's here, and I think actually art has always been a vehicle for the continuation and dissemination of esoteric and occult ideas. And this is a more conscious continuation of that. But you asked also, when Seligmann started to really get interested in this, and you asked it in the Q list, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this happened only after he moved to America. So before, within the surrealist context, they were researching into anthropological, ethnographical material. Seligmann did a long trip around the world, and he did field work in Northwest America, amongst a Native American tribe there. So he was very interested in the kind of science, mythology, in the sense of ethnography, but and this is very much outward directed in research. But when he moves to America, this kind of turns around. It's like he's moving inward, and since he can't travel so much, he's becoming this kind of librarian of the occult, and he starts collecting books. He comes from a trading background, so he knows how to find his network, so to speak, and he acquires this amazing collection of library of books on magic and the occult. And then he starts researching that from there, and then produces that history of magic from there.
Yeah, I'm sitting here just taking all of this in and I'm hearing a lot of different things, a lot of different ideas are coming into my mind that it seems to play into this whole idea of the cultic milieu, this atmosphere or this collective of seekers, as Campbell put it when talking about the cultic milieu. Colin Campbell in 1972 did a more of a sociological study about the practices, the spiritual practices, and the ideas that people had about religion and spirituality. And interesting that this, the United States. And when you mentioned the United States, it kind of made me start thinking about all the different movements that were going on in the United States, and this kind of ties again into what Pádraic was talking about how theosophy has had such influence on later ideas that kind of moved into what we would call "quote unquote" New Age ideas and all the things that go along with that. That's such a broad topic, or a broad field, I should say, of where a lot of different topics fit into that. So you could go from anywhere from like Eastern ideas about yoga and chakras and subtle bodies and all of that, but you can get into esoteric Christianity, you can get into UFOs, you can get into actually more of a continuation of the whole idea of peoples from Atlantis and Lemuria, and these are ideas coming from Blavatsky and her idea of the root races and all of that, even though that is a difficult and a concept that's not without its own challenges and without its own issues. People took some of those ideas and they made something new out of it. They made benevolent aliens coming back to help us, indigo children, all these different ideas about dreams, and such as that was started by, now I'm forgetting his name, Edgar Cayce. Sorry, my brain does went blank there.
I think it's also really important to mention that we haven't talked about Freud yet, and that actually it's about looking at the potential of the human mind as a tool, and rather than maybe summoning external entities or spirits, these are actually coming from within. They are contained already within the individual. They are facets of the individual, and that these processes are ways of sort of releasing, these entities. So that's maybe something that with Seligmann and other surrealists, certain behaviors like repetitious actions or some techniques, they're actual formal techniques, through chance, for example, are ways of unleashing that human or psychological potential.
Yeah, for sure. Of course, for the surrealists, Freud was a major source of looking into to the human mind, and I've always been kind of surprised by the fact that where Jung had so much influence, where Freud had so much influence through the surrealists on art, that there's hardly any trace to be found of how Jung has influenced artists and art actually. Certainly in the European context, he's kind of very marginal. He's not very present, and only after the Second World War and when the focus went to America, Jung comes into play actually. So for instance, in the work of Pollock, he's been important, and of course the surrealist influence on Pollock is certainly there, and that, but it is shifting in that attention of Freudian psychology to Jungian psychology and myth and more. Like the collective instead of the individual. So that's a kind of under-researched terrain, actually, I believe.
That's very interesting that you brought that up, Pádraic. I wasn't aware that. I would never have made a link that Freud was trying to make, or he was inspiring people in this case, to make a link with the entities that might be inside one. I would tend to agree with Ewoud that I would lean more towards Jung being the one to be talking about that and not so much Freud. So I find that very surprising
Oh, I wasn't claiming that Freud was I was more referencing the fact that these artists who were themselves looking to magical practices, they championed Freud's thinking. I'm not saying Freud was responsible for that.
No, I understand that. I would not normally make that connection that Freud could be the inspiration for that. It's being a layperson and not knowing the inspiration behind that. That inspired artists to look inside. I find this all very interesting, and forgive my clumsiness and my ignorance. So I'm reacting in just kind of a authentic way to what I'm hearing you both talk about today. There was one thing I wanted to come back to, though, when I was mentioning about the cultic milieu and the seekers, that the concept of the seeker came out of this idea. I wanted to ask Ewoud if he could talk about, well, you sent me a piece of your earlier work wherein you talk about your search for a new form of art practice and searching for new ways of doing what you're doing. And you wrote about an experience that you had that involved the Hebrew word for in the beginning, or the Hebrew, I guess the phrase, the Bereshit. And I thought that was quite powerful. And I thought maybe this would be a good idea or a good time for you to talk about that. Because you're looking inward, perhaps in a way, as Pádraic is talking about. You're looking for different avenues. If you could share a little bit about that.
Pádraic just used a word. What was it again? Synchronicities or something like that?
Serendipity.
Serendipities, yeah. Serendipities. When you start working with this material, stuff start happening that surprise you. These kind of moments that have a kind of surreal impact on you. And one of them, the meeting with Marco, for instance, and carrying the book. When I met Pádraic, I was just starting up a master in artistic research. I was right at the beginning of that, and it was really a turnaround in my practice to engage with that. And actually through my master, I came to the term post-secular as well, as through that research and repositioning of my art practice within these two fields of artistic research and post-secular art. But when around the time, it was a dream that I had. It's on. In an interview that happened a year after starting the master, I had an exhibition at Tent here in Rotterdam. I was nominated for a prize, and I was halfway my research, and I was interviewed for that exhibition, and I was telling about the dream that I had at the beginning of that research, and I was lying in bed, and I heard that word repeating all the time, Bereshit, or as I understood it when I heard it, it was Bereshit. I was hearing Bereshit all the time, and while I was doing that, I was laying a figure on the ground with colored sticks, and it was 5-pointed star, very occult sign, and I saw myself doing that repeatedly, and hearing that word repeatedly. And the way that I interpreted it later was that because it was such an action and it was an active performance, it was entering the field of performance in doing the research, so to speak, to be in the work as a person, as an artist. That was how I interpreted it then at the time, and it was a very intense because it really took all night. It was hours and hours of the same kind of drony, repetitive act.
So when did you find out about the actual meaning of what you thought was bear shit, but it was bear shit? It was a Hebrew word.
Yeah, well, it came out of a collection of writing of Crowley. And he wrote about this word also at an early stage, actually, of his own researches. So he starts looking into that word. And so I learned that the meaning of it was in the beginning.
I love that story. Yeah. That was great. Please check out the program notes for links to websites and books mentioned in Part 1, and join us for Part 2, where we talk more about the ritual function of art, the importance of exhibitions, automatism, and how art responds to radical change.